Welcome to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R Squared Global.
Welcome to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Ryan Ray, episode 51. And today we have another reoccurring guest, Markham Hislop, who's coming on a monthly basis for us now. So we really appreciate that. Be sure and go check out his work, and we will link to all of that in the show notes. You can find him at theamericanenergynews.com. We'll link to that. And he has his own page there called Markham on Energy, which is what these podcasts, when he comes on, will be called. Now, before we get into it, if you remember the first time that he came on, he talked about electrical vehicles and when will they be a big influence into the marketplace. And he's shifted his opinion, which I learned during this interview. So I think you will really find it interesting. It's a long discussion that we have here about what's going on and why he changed his opinion. And we also talk about the Paris Climate Agreement, so you might enjoy that as well. Here's my interview with Markham Hislop. Markham, how's it going today, man?
Good. How are you, Ryan?
Good. We're enjoying having you on regularly, so thank you for that. It's always good to talk to a guest more than once because you can kind of explore trends and topics a little bit more in depth, you know?
Yes, I agree. And I guess today we're going to be talking about electric vehicles and the future of oil, which we talked about in the first interview that you did with me. So I'm looking forward to revisiting that topic.
Yeah, that's a very fascinating discussion that I'm definitely looking forward to getting to. But before we go there, since the last time we talked, there was this thing you might have heard about in Paris, and President Trump. Did you hear about any of that going on up in Canada?
Oh, it filtered into our consciousness, yes.
So give us your reaction to the news on the U.S. And, you know, it's real quick, just before you give me your reaction. It's kind of funny. You know, the U.S. is pulling out by 2020. Of course, we could have a new president then who could, put us right back in it. But assuming that we pull out, what was your reaction to it and some of the rhetoric surrounding the discussion?
Well, from Canada's point of view, nothing changes because Canada is firmly committed to the Paris Climate Accord, and the federal government under Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and the Alberta government under NDP leader Rachel Notley have actually done a really, really good job with their energy and climate policies. In fact, the policies that the Alberta government has brought in under their climate leadership plan are actually having the effect of decarbonizing or lowering the carbon intensity in the oil sands heavy crude, which of course meets Paris Climate Accord objectives, and at the same time lowering costs, which is the oil sands aren't the highest cost producer in the global economy, but they are not the lowest either. And so there's an estimate, a study that was done out of the Canadian Energy Research Institute last month that said that if oil sands producers substitute solvent for natural gas, so instead of heating up steam, I mean, you guys in Texas are familiar with steam floods. You've used steam floods in the past. And it's kind of like that with the bitumen. You use the steam to soften it up so that you can pump it. Instead of doing that, use solvent to basically dissolve it and increase or make it more viscous. And by doing that actually saves the producers quite a bit of money. So from Canada's point of view, nothing much has changed. From Alberta, which is the big oil and gas producer, nothing much has changed. Down in the States, when Trump said that he was going to pull the U.S. out of the agreement, I made two observations to my Canadian readers. One is that the oil and gas industry really is committed to being environmentally friendly and responsible. What I've been told by oil and gas leaders is that's not going to change. And in fact, it's going to continue to intensify regardless of federal where the federal government goes under Trump. And the second thing is that as your readers or your listeners will know, the regulation for oil and gas is primarily around the responsibility of the states. And the states are really not going to change much. The Texas Railroad Commission will continue with the same policies that it had before. It's not going to change any. So really, from the oil and gas point of view, aside from some lightening around of regulations that will come from the EPA, my take on that is that there isn't going to be much change. It'll be kind of status quo.
You know, one of the things that I found interesting was there's a lot of politicians in the U.S. that were like, we've got to band together. And they came out and they started saying, well, this local government, city X is going to do it and company Y is going to do it. And all these local entities, whether it be a business or a town or a county or whatever, they're going to follow the Paris Accord plan. And I thought, well, okay, great. There's nothing wrong with that. That's beautiful that these companies decide that that's what they want to do and it's in their best interest. And so it was kind of funny that here in the States, at least, the federal government pulled out, and then a lot of people said, well, we're going to stay in, and then people were still upset. I was like, well, hold on. This is exactly what you wanted, right? Is that it wasn't like the when President Trump pulled out, everyone said, okay, we're abandoning that. It seemed that there was a lot of people who said, okay, well, that's fine, but we're still going to do it.
One of the things that's changed this time around that hasn't in past discussions around the environment and environment policy is changing technology. And the energy transition and clean energy technologies and technology change within the oil and gas industry is a keen interest of mine. I write about it all the time. There is some really, really great technology it's either developed and newly introduced into the oil patch, or there's more stuff coming down the pipeline, if you will. And I think that's, people are looking at that and they see the trend, globally for policy. They see the trend in the technology and, they can see where the future is going. And so nobody wants to go back to the 1950s, the way things used to be. And not only that, but moving ahead with some of this new technology is just good business. It lowers costs at the same time as it lowers emissions. So it's pretty hard to fly in the face of new, better technology. That's my takeaway.
Absolutely. Okay, well, let's get to the cars now. We've talked enough about that, but I don't want to bog down that discussion. But let's get to the cars. You've got an article here that we're going to link to in the show notes that says that, basically, electrical vehicles will kill the global oil and gas industry by 2030 from a Stanford economist. Kind of walk us through what was in his report and what are your thoughts on his findings?
Sure. Now, I report on electric vehicles a lot. And I actually have a little tech diffusion model in which I use to do my analysis. Just like Tony Seba from the Stanford economist has an econometric math model. I have a journalism model approach to this. And so there are two basic models around how electric vehicles will be adopted in the coming decades. So the first one I call the replacement model, and that's the Chevy Bolt and the Tesla Model S and the Tesla Model X, which is an SUV, and they basically compete with internal combustion engine cars that are for the same purpose. And the problem, that's going to be a very, very slow adoption because they're generally at least twice as expensive and they have limited range. So they're an immature technology. They're catching on with the innovators, the people who love gadgets, always got to have the new kind of thing. But they're really not challenging the automakers, and they're not challenging in the market share. Electric vehicles have less than 1% market share globally and about the same in the U.S. Under the replacement model, electric vehicles are not a severe threat to oil for probably at least 50 years and maybe 75 or 80 years. That's the long game. Now, Tony Seba came along, and he did his study, looked at the math of a different model. And that's where you take what he calls transportation as a service, and instead of privately owning a car, what families or individuals or commuters, whoever they might be, would call up their service company, it's like a taxi company. And they would have an autonomous electric vehicle that you call it on your app, and 2 minutes or 5 minutes or 15 minutes later, whenever you want it, the thing comes up, parks in front of your house, you get in, it takes you to where you want to go. And Seba's math shows that the cost of that per mile traveled will be 10% of the private ownership model.
Okay, let me hop in there real quick. So you're saying like a Uber almost, that you can just call and it'll be an electrical car and it'll come and pick you up. That's kind of what you're saying, like a automated electrical vehicle Uber.
Uber is leading the way on this in terms of autonomous electric vehicles as a service. And Uber will more than likely be a big player in this when the technology is ready in about 2023, 2025. And so that's exactly what I'm talking about. And the reason why costs are so low, and anybody who's in oil and gas will understand this, it's all about capacity utilization. So the average person with an automobile uses that vehicle 4% of the time, which is a very low utilization. Under the transportation as a service model, a company like Uber would use it minimum 40%, maybe 50, 60, 70, 80%, and that drops the costs dramatically. And so it's a what SEBA calls a disruption of 10 times. The costs are going to drop by a factor of 10. And that's the thing that's going to propel electric vehicles forward. And as part of his analysis, the study he did, he calculated the impact on the global oil industry. And which I don't agree with his conclusion on this, but nevertheless, he says that by 2030, oil consumption would drop from 100 million barrels a day down to 44 million barrels a day, basically destroying all but the lowest cost oil producers, which would be Saudi Arabia, Permian Basin, some of the other Middle Eastern producers. So SEBA is arguing for a revolution in transportation in the industry based on autonomous electric vehicles, with a side collateral damage of severe disruption in the oil industry.
Okay, so let me ask you a few questions here, because a couple things come to mind. If I'm in maybe New York City or downtown Dallas or San Francisco or LA, where you're in the heart of things, I could see where having us. If I stay in Houston, I'll use an Uber. But where I live, which is outside of the DFW Metroplex, it wouldn't benefit me to have to call a car, wait on it, come pick it up. I'd rather just own one and drive it. And so, is there really enough need for electrical cars that would be automated to pick you up and take you outside of these large metropolitan areas? And I would imagine that those areas already have populations with low car ownership already.
Anytime you're looking at a new technology, Ryan, there are two basic categories of factors that you look at least in my model. One is called the accelerators. And so the accelerators are all of those things which tend to accelerate the adoption of the technology. So lower price, greater value, higher convenience, the cool factor, whatever it might be. The other category are constraints, and those are the things that tend to slow down adoption. So in the case of the electric vehicle, it's high cost, low range, lack of familiarity, cultural issues, the structure of the existing transportation. I mean, there are just literally dozens of constraints. So if you look at it, there are far more constraints, and the constraints are much more serious under the replacement model for electric vehicles. In the what we call a TaaS, so shorthand for the transportation as a service model, then there are fewer constraints. But where this service will start is in the mega cities, the New York, LA, Houston, Vancouver, Toronto, London, those big cities that are congested, and time lost and congestion is a big cost to business and individuals, and places where they commute. So that's where it'll start. Once it gets established there, then we'll see if it moves out into the suburbs. We'll see if it moves out into the smaller cities, into the towns. Maybe it won't. Maybe we'll have a situation where these TaaS companies will operate primarily in the downtown core of the big cities and maybe out into the nearby suburbs. But beyond that, people will still continue with their private ownership model. There's a lot of ways that this can evolve, but the fact that the cost drops by a factor of 10 probably means that this model is going to catch on to some extent.
Okay, and one quick follow-up on that. If the cost of these type of cars drop by a factor of 10, what would that do for the cost of a regular pickup truck or an SUV that someone might have that's not in these mega cities?
Well, just to be clear, under the TaaS model, you wouldn't own a pickup truck or a car.
Right, I got you. Yeah, because it would be gone all the way.
Yeah. Now, if you're living in Midland, Texas, where most of my Texas buddies live and where our Texas office is based, chances are that you would continue to have a pickup. Now, I just did an interview with the chief engineer of a company called Havelaar Canada, and they're building the first electric pickup truck. And it'll be he was a bit vague on the pricing, but it might start, at somewhere around $60,000. And the advantage, of course, of the electric vehicle is lots and lots of torque. So if you were out in the oil field and maybe you needed lots of torque to lots of power to carry around a big welder, a portable welder, or you were hauling things, or that kind of a job, then an electric pickup truck could be very handy. It could pay for itself very quickly. So those kinds of things are coming, and a decade from now, you may very well have a pickup truck, electric pickup truck, and they might be more common. At this point in the game, that part of the industry is still very much in its infancy.
Okay, well, you said you disagreed, and I want to get to why you disagree with some of his findings in a second. But first, just kind of set a number for us here. What percentage of oil consumption comes from motor vehicles in the U.S.? So if we're looking at the U.S. market, we say, okay, well, we get out this many barrels. How much of that is being used by vehicles today?
44%.
Okay, so 44%, and that's why your article says, hey, guess what? If this comes true, it would basically be a huge blow to the oil and gas industry, especially in a place like where I live in Texas.
Yes, that's absolutely right. Now, I mean, quite a bit of oil, I think it's about 25%, gets used as feedstock for petrochemical plants. Another 9 or 10% is used by airplanes. The chances of electrifying airplanes is pretty much nil. A bunch of 4 or 5% gets used in marine shipping, so which uses bunker fuel now, and maybe they could move to natural gas, compressed natural gas, maybe not. Trains used 4 or 5%. So can you switch trains to gas? Maybe, but then you need a whole other infrastructure, and that becomes a constraint. So there are some of the demand for oil is kind of baked into industries where it's going to be very difficult to substitute. And demand from those industries will probably persist well into the latter part of this century, and may in fact, be a long-term usage of oil.
Taking a quick break in the action to thank our sponsor.
For over 20 years, R² Global has served the energy and infrastructure industries. With offices in Texas, Alabama, and Louisiana, R² Global offers engineering, survey, right-of-way, and GIS solutions. For more information, please visit www.goR2.com.
Okay, so tell me, what you said you disagreed earlier with some of his findings, some of his math maybe. Where do you think he got it wrong, and why do you think he got it wrong?
In my opinion, Tony Seba did something that all of the electric vehicle boosters do. Ryan, have you ever read anything by Bloomberg New Energy Finance about electric vehicles?
Yeah, a little bit, not a lot, but a little bit.
Well, there are a number of media out there that are like Bloomberg New Energy Finance. And when they're always hyping electric vehicles, always talking about how electric vehicles are going to take the economy by storm and they're going to kill internal combustion engine vehicles. And the reason why they make those kind of predictions is because you'll remember back a few minutes ago, I talked about that there are always accelerators and there are always constraints. Mm-hmm. Well, if you sit down with a spreadsheet and the only thing you look at is accelerators, then of course the world looks very rosy for electric vehicles. But if you include, as I do, in a balanced model, and you weight the accelerators with the constraints, that gives you a much more realistic view of what the timelines are for these kinds of things. So Tony Seba says, it's going to start in 2020 because autonomous driving technology is going to be available. Well, the Lux Research has a team of analysts dedicated specifically to autonomous driving technology, and they say, no, it'll probably be more like 2025. Then he assumes that just because the price of transportation drops by 10%, that everybody at every place is going to use it right away. And as we just discussed, the chances are that it'll catch on in the big cities where there are congestion issues and air quality issues and other issues, and it'll probably catch on last in the smaller communities, the rural areas, small cities, that kind of thing. So I see that even if TAS offers all of these benefits and gets pushed by government with a policy push, that you're probably looking more like 2050, 2060 before it has a significant impact. It's almost like a rule of thumb these days, Ryan, that if your listeners read something and they say, this technology is going to have this tremendous impact in a decade, add 2 or 3 decades to it.
Yeah, use a factor of 2 or maybe 3, huh?
Well, you know what, people, the Gartner research outfit came up with a model that is called the hype cycle. And it's got a really weird hype cycle curve. It looks like a big, well, I won't describe it because I can't do a very good job of it. But anyway, the important part of what Gartner did is they said in the early years of a technology, there are people like the developers and others that are related that get behind it and hype the technology. We see it with solar, we see it with wind, we see it with so many clean energy technologies, is that, you know, the environmentalists or the clean energy media, all of these guys, they hype all the time. And it gives you, and because they're talking about the future, I mean, you know, we won't know for another 10 or 20 years whether they're right. So it's really hard to call them on their exaggeration, on their hyperbole. But the work that I've done demonstrates that this process is the process of transitioning from fossil fuels to clean energy is a century-long process. It's rooted in the basic thermal efficiency of electric motors versus fossil fuels. Electricity, electric motor, the thermal efficiency is around 80%, 85%, and for an internal combustion engine, it's 15 to 20%.
So real quick there, we hop in. So what you're saying is basically the first time you came on this show, what you're saying is that this report, in your opinion, hasn't really done anything to persuade you to look, your outlook to be any different then.
Well, what it did is no, I wouldn't say that. It changed my attitude towards electric vehicles in a big way.
Oh, okay.
I was saying that electric vehicles would be 50 to 75 years to market dominance on a global basis. So in the U.S., and Canada, it might take 50 years. In places like Africa and Asia, it might be 75 years, roughly. But what CEBA's study did is demonstrate for the first time what I call the iPhone effect, or the iPhone moment. And when the iPhone came out in 2007, you could buy a flip phone for probably $100, $50. They were cheap at that point. But the iPhone was, I think it was $600 in the US. I think I paid $800 up in Canada for mine. But you bought it because it really wasn't a phone. It was a mini computer that just happened to make phone calls.
Right.
And whereas a flip phone would do 6 things, maybe you use it as a calculator and a few other things. With all the apps that come with a smartphone, you can do 6,000 things. And you can replace probably 15 or 20 devices, like alarm clocks and flashlights and all sorts of things. I mean, it's a fantastically valuable kind of a device. And so it went from zero to almost complete market dominance in less than a decade. And when you have a really, really big boost in value, like you do between the iPhone and the old flip cell phone, then technology can just explode out of the gates. And the TAS model has the potential to be an iPhone moment for electric vehicles. The replacement model will never, I don't foresee that there will ever be an iPhone moment, but the TAS model could be. And I think, not 13 years, but maybe 23 or 33 years, but that's a lot less than 50 to 75 years.
Right. So it could almost potentially cut your prediction originally in half then.
Yes. And I think that I sent out the study, CEBA's study, to a couple of experts, including Dr. Fred Beach at the Energy Institute in Austin, and had them look at it. And they said, oh, yeah, the math is fine. We understand the math. It's just that they agreed that the CEBA had not calculated in some of the constraints that I've talked about, and that would slow it down. But the math is good, and the value is there. And if the technology rolls out the way CEBA anticipates, 20, 30 years from now, we're going to have a really severe cut in the demand for oil, and that could affect economies like Texas. I mean, not so much the Permian, but what about the Eagle Ford?
Right.
What about the Bakken up in North Dakota, which is high-cost shale oil? What about around Colorado, places like that? So if demand for oil drops, American producers would be affected. Not all of them, but some of them.
Well, you brought up something earlier that I wanted to bring out is that you said that, well, some of these predictions, you're talking about decade, 2 decade, 3 decades out before they ever come to fruition. And so it's kind of hard to say, well, you're wrong here. And then 3 decades later, we come back and we say, well, see, I was right 3 decades ago. And there's a lot of things that change. But I do appreciate the fact that you're saying, well, the first time I came on, I said this, and there's new information. I came on, and now it looks different. And you know what, 3 months from now, something else could come out and maybe change my mind then. But it has to be good, well-reasoned information that makes me shift my opinion. And I think we kind of lose that as energy professionals sometimes, is that we kind of lose this thought that we don't need to be dogmatic in all of our views. We want to look at new evidence. We want to see new evidence, because your model that you presented the first time on the show, you were very passionate about your model, and so now it's refreshing to hear someone say, well, you know what, there's new things that might change my outlook on this.
Yeah, I took a lot of heat from my readers over they called it my about face on this issue. But it's exactly what you said. Once there's new information and solid new data to support it, then you have to change your mind. As a reporter, I didn't just look at the study and go, oh, okay, well, now this is something new. I went and I interviewed various experts in the EV, and I said, here's SEBA's analysis. Here are some of his arguments. What do you think about them? And then they would say, well, like the Lux Research folks said, well, no, autonomous driving technology isn't going to be available as quickly as he says. Therefore, you need to lengthen that timeline. And so when you do the hard work of reporting down in the trenches and you follow up these leads and get a good view of them, you can't predict with accuracy necessarily, but you can at least say something intelligent about what might happen or what's a good chance of happening in the future. And if you're an oil and gas company, let's say you're an oil company in Midland, you're Pioneer Natural Resources or you're Diamondback or any of those companies, you need to be thinking 10, 20, 30 years ahead so that you don't get stuck with stranded assets and you don't get stuck, producing, trying to make a go of it in a high cost or low demand environment. So, these things are, I think, keeping track of these kinds of technology trends is pretty useful for Texas oil and gas companies.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the 10 to 20 years out. One of the things I'm curious to see is over the next decade, how much of the Eagle Ford Shale that's in Texas sells its natural gas to Mexico, because there's been a lot of discussion about what's going on in Mexico. And, they have some constraints because they don't have the infrastructure in place to go out and drill all the wells. There's no power lines. There's no roads. There's no gas stations. There's just nothing. And, you go out to the Texas oil patch, obviously there's everything that you need. And so that Mexico is just not there. And so, we've been kind of having some discussion about, well, the next 10 to 15 years, how much of the gas in the Eagle Ford will go down to Mexico. You can kind of sit back and say, well, that could be very promising. But then there's this whole thing, well, all these people are investing a lot of money in Mexico, which could shift that dynamic in the next 5 years. And so when you look at these long-term predictions, you have to kind of say, well, this is what I think, but there's so many factors that could change this on a dime that it's really hard to be just super entrenched on your positions.
The foundation of the Western developed countries is cheap energy. And I think that's been true in the U.S. for most of the 20th and 21st century. Certainly it's true in Europe. And going forward for countries like Mexico, cheap energy is absolutely essential to their development of manufacturing and industry and becoming, developing their economy. I suspect, given the improvements that have happened with combined natural gas combined cycle power generation, that we're going to see in Mexico a lot of wind and solar backed up by gas. In fact, that's kind of the model that's emerging in Texas, and I think you'll see the same thing happen in Mexico. So even though the Mexico does produce some of its own gas and might produce more of it in the future as they reform the Mexican oil and gas market, I suspect that Mexico will kind of be like China and India, is that there will just be expanding demand to keep all of the producers busy.
One final question before I let you go. Just throw this out there. We didn't talk about it before, so catching you off guard here. What do you think, talking about long-term predictions, the Mexico's energy reform, how will that play out globally? Because, as we both know, we got the U.S. with all these folks who are independents and doing their own thing, and then globally you have the national-owned oil companies, and then you have Mexico who's kind of going through this transition period. And I've got friends around the world who I talk to, and They have problems with their state-owned oil and gas company. And I'm just wondering, will Mexico kind of be the catalyst for more countries around the world to go, you know what, we need to probably look at what Mexico's doing, see what they did right, see what they did wrong, and maybe open our borders up for more international type companies to come in and be entrepreneurial and try to take advantage of the marketplace?
You know, Ryan, I haven't written much about this, so I don't have a good informed opinion. So I'll give you my uninformed opinion.
Hey, that's perfect.
as long as I qualify it, and you know what you're getting.
That's right.
Your listeners know what they're getting. My take on that is I don't see the state-owned companies in places like the Middle East, Russia, or some of the European countries like Norway. I don't see them loosening their grip on their production at all. In fact, the security angle may give them more reason to hold on tighter to those companies. I think Mexico, in a way, is a unique case in that it is right next to the U.S. and really right next to Texas, which gives it access. If it opens up its fields to foreign companies, as it's doing, that gives them ready access to capital and technology and expertise. And so a lot of the other countries, the ones that have, like Venezuela and places like that, don't have that. But I don't see a lot of, the trend hasn't started yet to privatize national oil companies, and I don't see anything brewing that would lead me to believe that that's on the horizon.
Well, okay, we've got 20 years to discuss it and to kind of go back over it, because all this stuff we talked about is long-term predictions. Well, look, thank you for coming on again. We're enjoying these monthly discussions and learning a lot. Tell the listeners where they can find you, and we will link to that in the show notes for them.
Sure. They can come to www.theamericanenergynews.com. And for my columns, you can look under Markham on Energy, under that category, and you'll see all of my stuff, and we'll look forward. You can also find me on Facebook, where I hang out a lot to talk about energy, at Markham Hislop, Hislop. Just put that in the search, and you'll find me, and I'm always happy to get new Texas connections.
Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll talk to you next month.
Thanks for having me, Ryan. Look forward to it.
Thanks again to Markham for coming on. And really important to note there, as energy professionals, we need to step back and say, okay, this is what I believe. This is the data that I have. And as that data shifts and changes, it's okay to go back and re-examine what we thought was right, and what new information comes out, and how to view energy as a profession, and what's good and what's bad. And so I appreciate him coming on and saying, hey, you know what? A month or two ago, I thought this, and I've held that position for a long time. But now, you know what? There's new information out, and maybe I was wrong about that. And that's okay. We can appreciate that. And that's what we love about this show, is getting out there, discussing the issues, and trying to make sure that everyone is well informed about what is going on in the energy profession. One final thing, if you could leave us a rating and review in iTunes, it really helps spread the word about the show. We have had on some amazing guests, and we want them to get all the publicity that they can when they come on our show, and we want to get our reach out there as far as possible, because we really think that what we're bringing to our audience is of value. And if you agree, take just a few seconds, go to iTunes, leave us a rating and a review. We would really appreciate it. The Global Energy Leaders Podcast is produced by Michael Sims and Chris Prine. Chris Prine also serves as editor for the Global Energy Leaders Podcast. Until next time, keep climbing.
Thanks for listening to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R Squared Global.